So I want you to picture Mahatma Gandhi. Just get that image in your head.
Right, the iconic robes, the spinning wheel.
Exactly. And now picture the United Nations headquarters over in New York.
Oh, wow. Okay, quite a contrast there.
It is, right. But if you asked almost anyone on Earth today, they'd probably say these two forces were perfectly aligned. I mean, they're both fundamentally tied to this 20th century quest for global peace.
Yeah, you'd assume they were completely on the same page.
Exactly. You have the man who, practically invented modern nonviolent resistance, and then you have the institution built to permanently prevent World War III. But as we're going to see today, historical records reveal this really jarring reality.
It's pretty shocking when you first look at it.
It really is. The man synonymous with peace actually believed the very institution dedicated to peace was basically a fundamentally corrupt architecture, like doomed to fail from day one.
Yeah, he really didn't hold back.
No, he didn't. You might think these two forces were allies, but today we are going to unravel why Gandhi believed the UN and its cultural arm UNESCO were just catastrophic missteps for humanity right from the moment they were conceived.
Which, I mean, it completely shatters the conventional historical narrative we all grew up with.
Right, because we are so conditioned to view post-war globalism as this ultimate triumph.
Yeah, like the triumph of diplomacy over destruction. So to find out that the era's foremost advocate for nonviolence looked at the UN Charter and essentially saw a blueprint for perpetual conflict.
It's wild.
It is. It forces us to completely reevaluate the foundational systems of our modern world.
Which brings us to the actual mission of this deep dive today. We're unpacking a genuinely fascinating compilation of historical sources. These have been translated and synthesized by AI for us.
And it's a really diverse set of documents, too.
Yeah, we're looking at public press statements from the spring of 1945, detailed articles from Gandhi's weekly publications, like Young India and Haryandan, and some incredibly sharp personal correspondence.
The letters are amazing.
They really are, especially the crown jewel of this collection,
Right.
which is this legendary 1947 letter that just completely flips centuries of Western political philosophy upside down.
Oh, absolutely.
So our objective today is to rigorously explore Gandhi's profound skepticism toward the UN and UNESCO. We want to understand the exact mechanisms of his critique, right? Like why he thought their methods were hypocritical, why their structures were oppressive, and what radical alternatives he actually proposed instead.
I think it is crucial, though, to establish the parameters of our analysis today before we jump in.
Oh, absolutely. Go for it.
Right. So we are examining these historical documents strictly to understand Gandhi's philosophical and political framework. We are imparting his historically documented perspective to you, the listener.
Right. We aren't saying he's right or wrong.
Exactly. We are not endorsing his views over modern geopolitical systems, and we are definitely not taking sides on contemporary international conflicts. The goal here is pure comprehension of what is, honestly, a deeply disruptive historical viewpoint.
Well said. Because to understand how deeply he criticized the post-WWII order, we really have to start with a massive misconception.
Yeah, people get this wrong all the time.
They do. When people hear that Gandhi rejected the United Nations, the immediate assumption is that he was like a strict isolationist.
Right, that he just wanted India to hide away.
Exactly. That he wanted India to just draw his borders, lock the doors, and completely ignore the rest of the planet.
But that couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, the sheer irony of his critique is that Gandhi was actually an ardent globalist.
Wait, really? A globalist?
Oh, yeah. He spent decades passionately advocating for what he called the one world ideal.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize he used that exact phrasing.
He did. The concept of a world government wasn't repulsive to him at all. Actually, it was his ultimate geopolitical goal. He envisioned this highly integrated global society where nation-states functioned cooperatively.
So he wasn't opposed to the actual destination the international community claimed to be heading toward in 1945.
Not at all. He just thought the specific vehicle they were building to get there was going to drive them straight off a cliff.
Okay, that makes so much more sense. Let's situate ourselves in that critical moment then. It's the spring of 1945. The sheer devastation of the Second World War is just staggering.
It's hard to even wrap your head around the scale of it.
Right. Cities across Europe and Asia are reduced to rubble. Millions are dead. And so delegates from 50 nations are converging on the San Francisco conference.
To draft the UN Charter.
Exactly. They are actively drafting it. And the prevailing sentiment across the globe is this desperate, collective, never again.
The psychological atmosphere of that conference was incredibly intense. It was this mix of deep trauma and just desperate pragmatism.
Yeah. And Gandhi is observing all this from India, right?
Yes, he's writing extensively about it in Harijan. And he makes a profound distinction between his ideal world government and a pragmatic one.
Meaning he was willing to compromise.
He was. He openly states he would gladly accept a compromise like a flawed, rudimentary world federation that didn't perfectly align with his utopian vision.
But there was a catch, I assume.
A huge one. It had to meet one absolute, non-negotiable condition.
What was that?
It had to be built on a fundamentally nonviolent basis.
Which, I mean, that sounds like a given for a peace organization.
You'd think so, right?
Yeah.
But Gandhi's definition of nonviolence was radically different from the delegates sitting in San Francisco.
How so?
Well, he didn't just mean not actively dropping bombs. For Gandhi, imperialism itself was a state of constant systemic violence.
Oh, I see.
Right. So you look at the major players organizing the UN, Britain, France, and these are empires that are actively maintaining violent subjugation over massive global populations.
Right, they literally still have colonies.
Exactly. Gandhi's stipulation was that you cannot construct a fellowship of equals when the foundational dynamic of the architects is exploitation. The bedrock of any legitimate international order had to be the total eradication of colonial exploitation first.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I want to voice the immediate objection that jumps out at me, and probably at anyone who has ever tried to negotiate a complex deal.
Go for it.
It seems like Gandhi is demanding the impossible here. It's like being asked to join a neighborhood watch, but half the board members are actively holding other neighbors hostage in their basements.
That is a very dark but very accurate analogy.
Right. So, if you wait for the world to achieve perfect harmony and absolute equality before you even form a global organization, you will literally never form it. Don't you have to build the table first?
You mean get everyone in the room?
Yeah. Get the exploiters and the imperial powers to sit down and then use that forum to slowly dismantle the exploitation. Isn't getting everyone in the room the necessary first step?
It's a fair point, and it's actually the exact pragmatic argument the founders of the UN made at the time. They truly believed the institution would gradually civilize the power dynamics of the world.
Right, that it would tame them over time.
But Gandhi operated on a totally different sequence of historical causality. He argued that institutionalizing an unequal power dynamic doesn't cure the inequality. It permanently legitimizes it.
Oh, wow. I never thought about it like that.
Yeah, he insisted that first, all colonial independent countries must achieve complete freedom. Only after achieving sovereignty could they enter a supranational body as equal partners.
Because if the freedom doesn't precede the federation just becomes a new mechanism for the old coercion.
Exactly. It's a structural inevitability. If a colonized nation is forced or dragged into a global organization by its colonizer, the resulting institution isn't a democratic assembly, it's just a formalization of the empire's reach.
The power imbalance is literally baked into the DNA of the charter.
Yes. No matter how lofty the preamble of the UN Charter sounded, Gandhi saw it as a syndicate formed by unequals. And an organization formed by unequals is inherently an instrument of coercion.
So, because that foundation of equality was entirely absent, Gandhi looked at the actual physical architecture they were building in San Francisco and diagnosed it as structurally doomed.
He saw massive cracks in the foundation.
Right. Cracks that would inevitably collapse the whole project. And the sequence of how he dismantled this architecture is fascinating because each structural flaw basically causes the next one.
It's a domino effect.
Exactly. And it starts with what he saw as a complete moral vacuum.
Gandhi drew a very sharp distinction between a political treaty and a moral transformation.
Right.
He viewed the San Francisco Compromises not as a genuine pursuit of human brotherhood, but as a calculated balance of power arrangement among the victors of the war.
So it was basically the victorious nations negotiating how to divide the geopolitical spoils.
And how to avoid shooting each other while doing it, yes.
Think about the systems you rely on in your own life, at work, or in your community. How often are we just managing the symptoms of a toxic environment rather than curing the actual disease?
That's a great way to frame it.
Because in 1945, the symptom is a world war. But the disease is the underlying greed, the imperial ambition, and the selfishness of the individual nation-states.
And what's fascinating here is that Gandhi knew you cannot cure a disease by simply putting a new suit on the patient.
Right.
If the member states composing the United Nations are still internally driven by resource extraction, territorial expansion, and militarism, then the organization itself has no independent moral
It
compass.
just reflects the flaws of its members.
Exactly. It becomes nothing more than a bureaucratic arena for competing egos. It lacked a spiritual or moral foundation because the states that built it flat out refused to undergo any genuine internal reform.
And because the institution lacked that moral center, it couldn't rely on shared ethics to maintain order. It had to rely on brute leverage.
Which brings us directly to how Gandhi viewed the power distribution within the UN, specifically the UN Security Council.
Right, let's talk about the Security Council. This is where Gandhi's critique moves from, like, the philosophical realm to being highly tactical.
He recognized instantly that the Security Council, with its permanent members and veto power, was the true engine of the UN.
And he got a specific name for it, didn't he?
Yes, he labeled it a club of the strong.
A club of the strong. Wow. We really have to think about the implications of the veto power in the context of post-war imperialism,
It's crucial context.
because the permanent members were the major military powers. Any single one of them could unilaterally block the UN from taking action.
And Gandhi looked at that mechanism and concluded it was fundamentally impossible for this body to objectively protect oppressed nations.
I mean, the logic of the veto dictates that justice is totally subservient to power.
Exactly. Think about it. If an oppressed nation brings a legitimate grievance to the UN, and resolving that grievance conflicts with the economic or strategic interests of a great power,
That great power simply exercises its veto.
and the issue dies right there. Gandhi realized the system was exquisitely designed to protect the strong from each other. It was never actually designed to protect the weak from the strong.
It effectively enshrines extreme inequality right into international law.
It does.
The rightness of a cause doesn't even matter. The only thing that matters is the military and economic influence of the state wielding the veto pen.
Which then forces the UN to rely entirely on military might to enforce its version of peace. And this was the third and final fatal architectural flaw Gandhi identified.
Right, because if you have no moral authority and your governance is dictated by a few heavily armed empires, your only tool for maintaining the status quo is the threat of violence.
There is this press statement Gandhi made in April 1945, right as the delegates were gathering in San Francisco. It was published in the Bombay Chronicle and the Hindu.
What did he say?
It cuts through all the diplomatic theater of the era, he stated plainly. A peace based on the superiority of weapons is not peace, but preparation for a new war.
Oh man, preparation for a new war. That is chilling.
He viewed the entire concept of an armed peace as a dangerous delusion.
Well, yeah, because the victorious nations were retaining massive standing armies, developing new weapons of mass destruction, and maintaining global military bases.
All while claiming to be building an institution of peace.
Right. Gandhi saw this as profound deception.
It's the geopolitical equivalent of a hostage situation.
Exactly. If you are pointing a heavily armed weapon at a rival and demanding they don't move, you haven't achieved harmony. You've achieved temporary paralysis through terror.
Look at the geopolitical realities we still navigate today. How much of our global stability relies on the concept of deterrence, the threat of mutually assured destruction?
Most of it, unfortunately.
And Gandhi argued that deterrence isn't peace, it's a psychological pressure cooker. The UN was attempting to enforce peace using the exact same mechanisms that generated the conflict in the first place: military superiority.
So to Gandhi, an organization that relies on weapons to dictate terms is really just a rebranding of the old colonial model.
That's exactly how he saw it.
It's so intense. But he didn't just critique the flaws and walk away, right? He proposed a deeply challenging alternative.
He did.
Because if military deterrence just fuels the next war, how did he propose we actually stabilize the globe?
This is the territory where modern international relations scholars often dismiss Gandhi as hopelessly utopian.
I can imagine.
But he was deadly serious. His alternative required two unprecedented shifts in state behavior: unilateral disarmament and the deployment of a peace army.
Okay, I really struggle with the concept of unilateral disarmament. I mean, it's one thing to talk about nonviolence as a protest tactic within a state.
Sure, like the Salt March.
Exactly. But in 1945, proposing that a major global power simply destroy its own arsenals entirely on its own, without any guarantees from its rivals.
That's huge at Hast.
If a nation just drops its weapons, aggressive neighboring states or lingering fascist factions would just roll right over them. How is unilateral disarmament not just a recipe for national suicide?
But a lot of people asked him that.
Gandhi lived in the real world. How did he justify essentially handing victory to an aggressor?
He justified it through a deeply sophisticated understanding of human psychology and the mechanics of conflict.
Okay, explain that.
Gandhi understood that international relations were trapped in an escalating feedback loop of paranoia.
Like an arms race.
Precisely. Nation A builds a weapon out of fear. Nation B interprets that defensive weapon as an offensive threat, so Nation B builds a bigger weapon.
And then Nation A panics and escalates further.
Right. Every attempt at mutual disarmament fails because no one wants to be the first to lower their guard. They try to negotiate a 10% reduction in stockpiles while keeping their fingers hovering over the launch buttons.
Because the paranoia never dissipates. The tension remains completely unbroken.
Exactly. Gandhi argued that you cannot negotiate your way out of mutual paranoia. The only way to break the psychological feedback loop is a shock to the system.
A shock?
Yes. One nation has to possess the immense courage to step entirely outside the paradigm of violence, to dismantle its military completely.
It's like a classic cinematic standoff.
Oh, that's a good comparison.
Right. Everyone has a weapon drawn. The only way out isn't to build a bigger weapon. Someone has to be brave enough to drop theirs first, to break the tension.
Exactly. It requires a state to make itself supremely vulnerable.
It does. It's terrifying.
Gandhi acknowledged the massive risk, but he hypothesized that this act of supreme vulnerability, this absolute refusal to participate in the machinery of destruction, would generate an overwhelming moral force.
And that would do what exactly?
It would psychologically disarm the aggressor. Without the threat of retaliation to justify their hostility, the aggressor's narrative collapses. The violence loses its fuel.
But practically speaking, what happens when the aggressor invades anyway? If you have no military, what is the actual defense mechanism?
This leads us to the peace army.
Right, the peace army.
The peace army was the application of ahimsa, which is the ancient Indian principle of non-injury and compassion, but scaled up to a national defense strategy.
How does that even work on a national scale?
Gandhi envisioned highly disciplined squads of unarmed volunteers. These individuals would be rigorously trained not in combat, but in conflict resolution, spiritual endurance, and absolute nonviolence.
So they wouldn't be standing on borders with rifles?
No, they would literally be interposing their physical bodies between warring factions or invading forces.
Like human shields.
Exactly like human shields. The core mechanism of the peace army is the willingness to absorb suffering without retaliating.
Wow.
The psychological premise is that witnessing unearned, unresisting suffering eventually touches the conscience of the oppressor. It forces the invader to recognize the humanity of the people they are attacking.
I mean, it sounds incredibly abstract, almost naive.
It does sound that way to modern ears. But Gandhi wasn't a philosopher locked in a tower. He was a tactician who had used this exact psychological mechanism to cripple the economic and political machinery of the British Empire in India.
That's true. He actually did it.
He proved that an unarmed populace willing to endure immense suffering could render an occupying army completely powerless. He just wanted to scale that proven tactic to the global stage.
And he felt a desperate urgency to do so, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because he had watched the alternative fail catastrophically.
Yes. The sources remind us that Gandhi had analyzed the collapse of the League of Nations extensively in the Harijan Weekly back in 1939.
The League of Nations being the UN's predecessor, created after World War I.
Exactly. And it operated on the exact punitive logic Gandhi despised.
Right. So when a nation became aggressive under the League of Nations, the League responded with economic sanctions and the threat of combined military force.
They tried to punish violence with coercion.
And Gandhi noted in 1939 that this punitive approach didn't foster peace at all.
No, it fostered deep, simmering resentment in nations like Germany, which eventually exploded into World War II.
So he was looking at the UN Charter in 1945, seeing the exact same reliance on sanctions and military force.
And warning the world that they were simply reloading the gun for a third world war.
Man, okay, so if the UN, with its Security Council vetoes and its armed peacekeeping forces, represented a catastrophic failure of physical action, we have to turn our attention to the philosophical architecture being built concurrently.
Yes, the intellectual side of things.
Because the UN was the machinery, but machinery requires software. And that software The moral and cultural framework for this new world order was being written by UNESCO.
Right, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization.
Exactly. So while the politicians in San Francisco were dividing up military power, the intellectuals were trying to forge a new global consciousness.
And this collision of worldviews produces what is arguably the most fascinating document in our source material.
The May 25, 1947 letter.
It is a stunning artifact. It perfectly encapsulates the friction between Western bureaucratic intellectualism and Eastern spiritual pragmatism.
Let's reconstruct the context for the listener. So Julian Huxley is an evolutionary biologist, a prominent British humanist, and he's the first Director General of UNESCO.
He's a very big deal in intellectual circles.
Right. And he launches this incredibly ambitious project. He sends letters to the most prominent thinkers, philosophers, and political figures across the globe.
He's essentially crowdsourcing the philosophical bedrock for what will eventually become the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
But Huxley is operating within a deeply Western Enlightenment framework, isn't he?
Oh, entirely. He expects these great minds to send back sweeping academic treatises on the inherent dignities of man, detailed taxonomies of human liberties, complex legal justifications.
Typical bureaucratic academic stuff.
Exactly.
So he writes to Mahatma Gandhi, assuming that the man who mobilized hundreds of millions of people for freedom will provide this masterpiece of political theory regarding human rights.
And the imagery of this moment is just incredible.
It really is. Paint the picture for us.
Well, you have Huxley sitting in a bureaucratic office in Europe administering this very formal global symposium. And Gandhi, according to the sources, is writing his response while sitting on a moving train headed to Delhi.
He is literally immersed in the chaotic, visceral reality of a nation violently tearing itself away from empire.
Right. And Gandhi doesn't send back a treatise.
No, he doesn't.
He sends a brief radical note that entirely rejects the premise of Huxley's request.
He looks at the entire Western obsession with defining, categorizing, and demanding rights, and he essentially tells Huxley that UNESCO is looking through the wrong end of the telescope.
Yeah. Here's where it gets really interesting.
I want to read the core of what he wrote on that train, because the translation we have captures the weight of it perfectly.
Please do.
Gandhi writes, I learned from my illiterate but wise mother that all rights to be deserved and preserved come from duty well performed. Thus, the very right to live accrues to us only when we do the duty of citizenship of the world. From this one fundamental statement, perhaps it is easy enough to define the duties of man and woman and correlate every right to some corresponding duty to be first performed. Every other right can be shown to be a usurpation hardly worth fighting for.
A usurpation hardly worth fighting for.
It gives me chills.
It is a devastating critique, and it's delivered with total serene confidence.
Huxley asked for a list of rights, and Gandhi effectively replied that rights don't even exist in a vacuum.
The contrast is staggering. You have the highly educated cosmopolitan elite of UNESCO trying to engineer a new global morality through sophisticated legal paperwork.
And Gandhi just bypasses their entire intellectual framework by invoking the wisdom of his uneducated mother.
Yes. He is exposing a fatal flaw in the way the West constructs society. UNESCO was building an intellectual system focused on what the world owes the individual.
Right.
Gandhi's framework, rooted in his mother's teachings, asserts that you cannot receive what you are owed until you have first paid what you owe to the world. Duty must always precede right.
If you demand a right without first fulfilling the corresponding duty, he calls it a usurpation.
Exactly.
You are claiming ownership of something you haven't earned. You are extracting value from a system you haven't contributed to.
And this was not mere semantics for him. Gandhi firmly believed that if UNESCO succeeded in building a global culture obsessed with rights while ignoring duties, they would inadvertently engineer a deeply unstable, selfish world.
And our sources actually break down his profound skepticism of this rights-first approach into three specific mechanisms of failure.
Right. Egoism, paper promises, and hypocrisy.
Let's explore the mechanism of egoism first, because this gets the sociological heart of his argument. Why does demanding a right inherently cause a clash of egos?
Well, because a right is fundamentally an entitlement. It places the individual or the nation-state at the absolute center of the universe, looking outward at what society must provide for them.
It's very self-centered.
It is an individualistic, boundary-setting concept. If I declare my right to property or my right to a specific resource, I am drawing a circle around myself and telling everyone else they cannot cross it.
So society basically becomes this massive overlapping grid of boundaries.
Hmm.
Everyone is aggressively defending their little circle.
Precisely. And eventually, those boundaries rub up against each other. My right to extract resources conflicts with your right to a clean environment.
Right.
When the entire system is built on demanding rights, you institutionalize friction. It becomes a zero-sum game of extraction where everyone wants to take and no one is incentivized to give.
And then you need a massive, coercive legal apparatus, like the UN, to constantly adjudicate the endless collisions of ego.
But a duty operates on the exact opposite mechanism.
How so?
A duty is centrifugal. It directs energy outward. It doesn't ask what society must provide for the individual. It asks what the individual must provide for the whole.
It is communal and bridge building.
Exactly. If a society is oriented around the duty of care, the duty of nonviolence, the duty of mutual aid, then the rights are naturally fulfilled without needing to be demanded.
That makes perfect sense. If everyone is fulfilling their duty to not harm others, the right to safety is automatically met.
Yes. By focusing exclusively on rights, UNESCO was ignoring the engine that actually produces a functioning society.
That perfectly explains his second critique, paper promises. We can think of it like an economic system, right?
That's a good analogy, yeah.
Gandhi viewed rights as the currency circulating in a society and duties as the gold standard sitting in the vault backing it up.
I like that.
So UNESCO was essentially trying to print billions of dollars in paper rights, publishing these grandiose declarations in Parisian symposiums, like the 1949 collection edited by Jacques Maritain, where this letter was featured.
They were flooding the market with paper currency.
Exactly. But there was no gold in the vault. There was no foundational commitment to moral duty backing up those declarations. And if you print currency without backing, the inevitable result isn't profound wealth. It's hyperinflation.
The paper becomes worthless.
Right.
Gandhi understood that ink on a page does not alter human behavior. A government cannot grant a true right. A right is merely the natural downstream consequence of a community fulfilling its moral obligations.
So if the citizens in the states have not internalized their absolute duty to each other, a published list of human rights is just a tragically naive piece of paper.
Exactly. The paper cannot protect anyone when the moral backing is completely absent.
Which brings us to the most visceral and immediate critique Gandhi leveled at UNESCO, the staggering hypocrisy of the authors.
We have to remember who was drafting these beautiful, eloquent texts on the freedom of speech, the freedom of conscience, and the inherent dignity of all mankind.
It was the representatives of the Western powers.
Yes. The exact same powers that, at that very moment, were holding vast populations in colonial subjugation.
They were actively exploiting the resources of conquered nations. They were segregating their own societies. They were aggressively building up arsenals of nuclear weapons.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, for Gandhi, the context was inescapable.
Right.
You have the historical architects of global imperialism sitting in comfortable rooms in Europe, intellectually debating the nuances of human freedom.
It's almost grotesque when you frame it like that.
A Declaration of Rights written by active violators carried absolutely zero spiritual weight for him. It was an exercise in performative morality.
He believed that before any of these nations had the standing to declare a single human right, they first had to demonstrate genuine, agonizing repentance.
They had to act.
Yes, they had to immediately renounce their violence, dismantle their empires, and fulfill their staggering, unfulfilled duties to the nations they had systematically oppressed for centuries.
Without that tangible action, drafting a Bill of Rights was just adding a veneer of intellectual civilization over a core of barbarism.
Wow, so we have the full weight of Gandhi's diagnosis now.
We do.
He believed the UN's physical architecture was built on an unequal, violent foundation that relied on the tools of war to feign peace. And he believed UNESCO's philosophical architecture was a hypocritical house of cards, printing paper rights without the moral gold standard of duty.
So the critical question we have to ask as we look at the history that followed.
Right. Was Gandhi's extreme skepticism vindicated?
Let's transition to the modern reality. Did the UN and UNESCO prove the Mahatma wrong? Or did the flaws he identified fracture exactly as he predicted?
Well, we must impartially note that UNESCO has achieved undeniable monumental successes, particularly in the realm of cultural preservation.
Yes, the source text highlights some of their greatest triumphs, to be fair.
Right. Their mandate to protect the shared heritage of humanity has yielded incredible results. The international campaign to save the Abu Simbel temples in Egypt from the rising waters of the Aswan Dam was a triumph of global cooperation.
Absolutely. And their efforts to preserve the sinking city of Venice, their global literacy campaigns, these are profound contributions to human civilization. No one denies that.
But when we shift our gaze from cultural preservation to the political and legal arenas to the actual prevention of violence and the protection of human life, the foundation Gandhi warned about looks structurally compromised.
It really does. The first metric we have to examine is violence unstopped.
Right. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was eventually adopted, and it remains a beautifully written document. It explicitly guarantees the right to life, liberty, and security of person.
But as Gandhi predicted, those paper rights possessed no inherent power to stop atrocities when the powerful actors lacked the moral duty to intervene.
Look at the horrific events of the late 20th century. The genocides in Rwanda, in Cambodia, in the former Yugoslavia.
Millions of human beings possess the universal right to life on paper.
But that paper was utterly meaningless while they were being slaughtered.
And why did the international community so often fail to stop the slaughter? Frequently, it traces right back to that structural flaw in the UN Gandhi identified in 1945.
The Security Council veto.
Yes.
The club of the strong.
Exactly. When those humanitarian crises erupted, intervention was frequently blocked or delayed because taking action conflicted with the geopolitical strategy or regional alliances of a permanent member.
So a major power would use their veto to protect their interests, entirely ignoring their moral duty to protect the innocent.
The very structure of the UN actively paralyzed the enforcement of the rights UNESCO had so carefully declared. Power vetoed morality, exactly as Gandhi foresaw.
There is also a profound sociological consequence to building a global culture entirely around the concept of rights. The source texts identify what they call the crisis of rights without duties.
This is where Gandhi's letter about his mother feels incredibly relevant to the cultural moment we are living in right now.
Completely. Modern consumer societies have become intensely litigious and deeply fractured. We see groups constantly aggressively mobilized to fight for their political, social, and economic rights.
And to be clear, fighting for justice and equitable treatment is strictly necessary.
Oh, absolutely. But the observation here is that the language of demand has completely monopolized our culture. We are universally hyper-aware of what we are owed.
Right, but the language of duty, the concept of mutual concession, of civic obligation, of taking personal responsibility for the health of the community, has almost entirely evaporated from public discourse.
It is the exact manifestation of the egoism Gandhi warned Julian Huxley about.
Yes. When a society trains its citizens to obsessively demand their rights, but forgets to instill a rigorous sense of duty to one another, the social fabric shreds.
You end up with a highly polarized, fragmented society where everyone feels aggrieved because their overlapping boundaries are constantly colliding, and no one feels the obligation to compromise or serve. We really have to ask ourselves as we consume the daily news, are we a society completely obsessed with extracting what we believe we are owed, while totally forgetting what we owe to each other?
It's a tough question. Finally, the sources point to the historical reality of double standards in the application of these rights.
This highlights Gandhi's critique of hypocrisy.
Right. In the decades since 1945, human rights have frequently been weaponized as geopolitical tools.
Strong, wealthy nations will routinely invoke human rights rhetoric to justify imposing crippling economic sanctions or even launching military interventions against weaker, rival states.
But those same strong states will look the other way and completely ignore identical or even worse human rights violations when they are committed by their own strategic allies or economic partners.
The rights are not universal. They are applied selectively based on power dynamics and military alliances.
Which brings us full circle to Gandhi's assertion that a system built by empires will always serve the interests of empires, regardless of the noble language they use to disguise it.
It proves Gandhi's fundamental thesis, doesn't it? Institutions cannot transcend the moral nature of the people and the states that create them. You cannot legislate a utopia.
No, you can't.
You cannot draft a perfectly worded treaty that will somehow bypass the necessity of changing human nature.
If you attempt to enforce global peace through military dominance and paper declarations, without requiring nations to fulfill their moral duties and genuinely renounce violence, you are engaging in an illusion.
It's like trying to build a magnificent roof for humanity while neglecting to lay a single brick of the foundation.
Exactly. The architecture might look beautiful for a time, but inevitably, the laws of gravity assert themselves and the structure collapses under its own weight.
And that profound tragic reality is the core of Gandhi's relationship with these global institutions. He desperately wanted the building to stand. He devoted his life to the pursuit of a unified, peaceful, one world.
But his relentless dedication to truth meant he refused to participate in the collective delusion that a roof could simply float in midair.
He forced the world to look at the cracks in the concrete, even when they desperately wanted to celebrate the architecture.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
Let's pull all these threads together as we wrap up this deep dive. We started with the jarring realization that Gandhi, the ultimate icon of peace, fundamentally distrusted the UN.
We explored how the San Francisco Compromise failed his non-negotiable test of equality, essentially allowing imperial powers to masquerade as a democratic federation.
Right. And we examined the physical machinery of the UN, the moral vacuum that necessitated military deterrence, and that Security Council veto that empowered the strong at the expense of the weak.
And we grappled with his radical alternatives, breaking the psychological paranoia of deterrence through unilateral disarmament and deploying the nonviolent power of the peace army.
And of course, we charted his philosophical collision with UNESCO. The incredible image of him riding on a train to Delhi, telling the intellectuals of Europe that trying to declare rights without first demanding duty is just a usurpation.
It's printing currency without the gold to back it up.
Exactly. When we view the modern historical records through his skeptical lens, the unchecked genocides, the selective weaponization of human rights, and our culturally fragmented obsession with entitlement, it is deeply unsettling how accurately he predicted the failures of the systems we rely on today.
It really is.
We spend an enormous amount of our lives today debating our rights. We argue constantly about what we are entitled to from our governments, what we are owed by our employers, and what we deserve from our communities.
The language of extraction is the default language of modern existence.
But if Gandhi and his mother were right, if true rights only spring into existence as the natural consequence of a duty well performed, it forces a profound shift in perspective.
It really changes everything.
Think about that currency you might be trying to print in your own life. What is the duty you owe right now, today, to your community, to your family, or as a citizen of the world, before you claim your next right? Go check your vault. Ensure the gold is there before you demand the paper.
It demands that we move from a mindset of passive extraction to a mindset of active contribution.
So what does this all mean? History is rarely as clean as the symbols we use to represent it. The icons of peace are vastly more complex than we realize, the institutions we trust are structurally flawed, and the answers to global harmony demand significantly more of us than simply signing a treaty. It requires a fundamental, rigorous shift in how we relate to one another. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into a profoundly challenging piece of history. We hope it gave you a new lens through which to view the world. Stay curious, keep questioning the foundation, and we'll see you next time.